Hello everyone! So today I'm going to be talking about some of the books that I've read recently, and these are essentially the books that I've read since 2020 started. I'm kind of proud of myself for how much I read because I did have a pretty big workload in terms of classes this semester. We also got a variety of genres here. We got nonfiction, we got historical fiction, we got historical fantasy, we got contemporary, and also only 2 of these books are YA, which is really weird considering that's like the majority of the books that I read. So without further ado, let's just get started. So the first book that we have is Pan's Labyrinth, The Labyrinth of the Faun by Guillermo del Toro and Cornelia Funk. And I'm not gonna lie, what initially drew me to this book was this cover. I saw it on the shelf of the library for like new releases and I was like, whoa, that's really pretty. It just gives me like this enchanted forest vibes, which I'm always down for. I also was like kind of aware of the fact that this was a movie, even though I've never seen it before, but I do know Guillermo del Toro and I watched his Troll Hunter show, which I love, so I figured that I might enjoy this other story that he created. So this takes place in Spain in 1944 during the Francisco Franco regime, and the story follows a 13-year-old girl named Ophelia when she and her mother move in with her mother's new husband, who is a general in Franco's army. And Ophelia is very upset with this change and this new life that she has, and she ends up finding solace in fairy tales. But one day she is visited by the mythical faun, Pan, who tells her that she is a lost princess but that she needs to complete 3 magical tasks in order to come back to her home. The story truly does feel like a fairy tale, one because of the lyrical writing and also because there's beautiful illustrations throughout, but there are also fairy tales weaved into the story. You kind of have 2 main plots going on. You have the present-day storyline of Ophelia during World War II, but you also have these interconnecting fairy tales that relate back to what's going on with Ophelia, and as you move through the story, you see the connections building. I absolutely adored the way that these 2 storylines are woven together because they complemented each other so much. And I think that's just an element that I really tend to enjoy in stories, is when they interweave 2 different storylines and 2 different plots and timelines. So I found this in the YA section, but when I started the book, I really thought it was middle grade because of the age of the main character. She's 13, and there's also this like kind of innocent and naive tone to the narrative. But I was quickly proven wrong. This is pretty dark. Even though I said there were 2 main storylines, there is a kind of subplot within Ophelia's timeline during World War II that has to do with the rebel soldiers and the resistance to Franco's regime. Especially as a lot of these people live in close proximity to the captain and are constantly in danger. In that regard, I kind of wish there was a little bit more tonal consistency because I did kind of feel a bit blindsided by the sudden change in brutality, I guess you could say. But the story does very well deliver on making you feel that tension and raising the stakes to a point where you actually feel concerned about what's going to happen. Even within that family dynamic of Ophelia, her mom, and Captain Vidal. Captain Vidal is a villain. He is the trope of like the evil step-parent, but he also knows that Ophelia's mom is the way that he will get an heir, and that made him even more villainous because of his methods of abuse and manipulation and victimizing Ophelia in a way that didn't allow himself to be incriminated. You really do feel for Ophelia in this book and what she has to deal with. I wish we got to explore a little bit more of the magical elements of this book because I feel like they were kind of glossed over and also felt a bit rushed in comparison to the other events going on in the novel. But otherwise, I highly recommend this. I gave this 4 stars. I don't really see a lot of people talking about it, but I really think it's a great historical fairy tale-esque fantasy. So the next book that I read was Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee, and this was kind of a different novel for me. So this book explores the life of cancer, essentially. It says biography of cancer instead of history, and it tracks it from the very first time that it was documented 3,000 years ago up until we are today in our understanding of where the field is and where it needs to go. So I started out 2020 with a goal of trying to read more nonfiction books, and in retrospect I probably shouldn't have started with this one. Maybe I should have started with like a memoir, something more narratively consistent to what I usually read. But I chose this book because I'm a pre-med student, and regardless of what field you're going to go into, I think it's really important to understand cancer since it's such a prevalent issue in our society and how it permeates through various aspects of our lives. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out that I really enjoyed this book. My biggest fear was that it would be too dense and that I wouldn't want to pick it up, that I'd have to kind of force myself to read it. But it was actually very digestible and I never felt overwhelmed. What I really appreciated was that at the beginning of each chapter, there was quotes or an epigraph, either from real people or from stories. Like I think there was one from Alice in Wonderland, and the author would use that as a creative way to describe and explain what's going on. I love me some good metaphors, so I appreciated that. I also really liked the fact that this book looks at cancer from a lot of different lenses. So obviously you have the scientific and historical lens, which is what the book is based off of, just tracking it throughout time. But you also explore the political and the economic aspects of getting funding for research and battling with companies like the tobacco industry to get the proper information about the health risks out to the public. There also was a feminist discussion regarding breast cancer and the treatments and how they haven't always been respectful of bodily autonomy for women. There are great questions about medical ethics regarding trials for cancer treatments, and also questions just like, how do we even define success? Like when we look at the population, how do we know we are moving forward? The only time that I really started to get bored was when we were delving really deeply into the business and politics side. While I really enjoy parts of that discussion, that's just not something that I am wholeheartedly interested in. But regardless, it was valuable information to know. I mean, this book did win the Pulitzer Prize, so I don't even feel like I'm at liberty to even give a verdict about whether it's worth reading or not, but I do recommend it. So the next thing I read was Unoriginal Tales by Ahmad and Naimi. This is a collection of short stories that take place in Oman that all have a fantastical twist. This was sent to me by the author as an e-arc, but now it is available. You can buy it on Amazon. But of course, these are all my thoughts. So overall, I did enjoy this. I thought it was a really quick read. It's like 80 pages, I think. There's a variety in the level of fantasy between each story. Like some stories are completely in a fantastical setting, fully use magic, have magical creatures, and some are more rooted in contemporary society, in the vein of magical realism. And I will admit this was a bit jarring at first because I just wasn't expecting it, but once I knew that, it kind of made it fun to see what the next story was going to be. All of these stories tackle some issue or some experience in Oman, which I thought was really cool to see. And with that, there's also a level of variety within the degree of seriousness. So there's some stories that deal with things like postpartum depression or embezzlement, and others that deal with someone who just wants to go eat Five Guys but keeps running into obstacles in the parking lot. An issue I find with short story collections is that sometimes the fact that the actual length of the story is very short limits this potential of the story and my potential to enjoy it. It can be difficult with short stories to really compel a reader with characters and plot when you don't have a lot of time to explore that. And for that reason, I did think some of the stories fell a little flat. Not to say that they were bad, I just didn't have as much of a connection with them. And when I looked back, I did realize that I enjoyed the longer stories more, and I think it's for that reason that we got to explore things just a little bit more. One story I really loved was called Please Don't Do This to Me, which is about a boy trying to maneuver and navigate this marriage to a girl that he loves, but maybe is not the relationship that he's after. And I just really enjoyed seeing that character development even in such a short period of time. And I really liked how the story portrayed how sometimes it's really hard to see a one-sided relationship for what it is and to move on with that. And I also really liked the story called Embezzle. It follows two victims of governmental corruption as they team up and kind of lead two different lives in order to eventually work together to stop this corrupt government and help all those that were disenfranchised. Again, I love the themes, and I also liked that it kind of had a mini heist vibe, and I gave this 3.5 stars. The next book I read was Us Against You by Fredrik Backman. This is the sequel to Beartown, which I read a year ago. And this duology is kind of a deep dive into the minds of the people in this really small town in Sweden called Beartown. It looks at the different relationships within the community, as well as just how much hockey permeates throughout the culture and the identity of this town and its people. And Beartown explores the lead up and the aftermath of when the star of the hockey team rapes the daughter of the general manager of the hockey club. And without giving too much away about the first book, Us Against You takes place a few months after, and we see the hockey club trying to get back on its feet, especially as they hire a new coach who is a woman, which is not that well received within this community. And we also follow more closely one of the side characters from Beartown, who is gay and closeted. So if you've heard me talk about Beartown, you know that I absolutely adored it. It is one of my favorite books of all time now. I read it more than a year ago, and I still think about it to this day and how much it affected me. Fredrik Backman's prose is so simplistic, yet so poignant and powerful. It is such an effective rhetorical strategy to portray these complex and nuanced issues with such simplistic writing. And that writing style and the way that it incorporates thematic elements was consistent in this book as well, so I absolutely loved it. A big focus of this book that you might presume from the title is the competitive nature and how that can lead to kind of dire consequences, specifically between Beartown and its rival town as they gear up towards their annual game versing each other. It showcases the potential toxicity that comes with being so proud of your town and the idea that there is an us against you. I gave this 4.5 stars, and the only reason why I didn't give it a full 5 stars is because I think portions of the beginning were a bit repetitive from Beartown. Like, it was reminding us about what happened, but it also felt like the statements being made were just rehashing what we already knew. But around like the 35-40% mark, it really starts holding its ground and being really impactful in its own way. If you haven't read a Fredrik Backman book, you should do it because they are so good. There hasn't been a single Fredrik Backman book that I haven't enjoyed. Next, I read The Golem and the Jinni by Helene Wecker. This takes place in turn of the century New York City, and we follow a Jinni who is a being made of fire, as well as a Golem who is a being made of clay. On the ship ride to New York City, the Golem's master dies, and that leaves her alone, masterless, and only a few days old in a brand new city. And she ends up getting taken in by a rabbi who teaches her how to be more human. The Jinni, on the other hand, ends up being accidentally released from his lamp when it ends up being acquired by a tinsmith. And he too has to learn how to be human, how to blend in this new world that he's not used to. The Golem and the Jinni end up meeting and find solace within each other as they are kind of the only people who understand what the other is going through. Now, before I get into anything, I'm just gonna say, because I feel like the last sentence I just said alluded to it, there is no romance in this book. This is not a romance. And so I don't think you should go in expecting a romance. But relationships and how people are connected is definitely a really important aspect of this book. Probably possibly the most important aspect. So the way that the author actually pitches this book is that it's an immigrant story inside of an immigrant story. And I really agree with that. Even as we follow the Golem and the Jinni, we're also learning more about the people that they're interacting with in the respective Jewish and Syrian communities. Like, we learn about a man who had to abandon his life as a doctor in Syria and now runs an ice cream shop in Little Syria. And we also follow the rabbi's nephew, who kind of has a difficult relationship with religion as a first-generation American. And so I like the fact that these true immigrant stories were framing this immigrant story of two mythical beings trying to find their way in New York City, and definitely helped situate the allegorical aspect of the novel with real context. I really loved the way that the author developed the personalities between the Golem and the Jinni. Like, the character work was excellent. She utilized kind of the innate features of their creation to influence their personalities. So for example, the Golem is made of clay, and she also has this desire to conform to whatever everyone else needs her to be. And this is also compounded by the fact that she can actually sense people's emotions, like she can understand people's desires and feel them, and has a need to fulfill that for them. This obviously poses some issues if that is overextended. And the Jinni is a creature made of fire, and so he's rash and abrasive and does not like to be contained, which poses an issue as he has to fit this mold of being a human being, and he can't live the life that he once had. And in these ways, the Golem and the Jinni clash in a lot of ways, but they also are the only people who understand what the other person is going through, and I really liked that dynamic of their relationship. There's a bit of a mystery element to the story as well, because the Jinni can't remember how he got into the lamp. He remembers details of his life prior, but he doesn't know how he was actually imprisoned. And so throughout the novel, we get glimpses and hints as to what went down until finally in the end, it all starts connecting back together. And like in Pan's Labyrinth, I just love when there's kind of interweaving plots going on. I find it so compelling. My actual reading experience was actually not the best. It took me a long time to really get into this book, like at least the halfway point. It was just frankly very slow, and I could only take it at like a chapter at a time before I had to like take a break. But there's a very clear turning point where the stakes just rise and the plot really starts moving. And from that point, I was like hooked. I couldn't put the book down. It's really weird because with a lot of these character-driven stories, especially with historical ones, it always takes me a little bit to get into them. And so I don't really love reading the beginning part. But once I get to the end and I see what all that subtle buildup was going to, I really appreciate that. So it's kind of like a give or take. Like, you win some, you lose some. And while I did enjoy the ending as a whole, I do wish we spent a little more time kind of digesting what happened and talking about it. It kind of felt like the climax happened and then we were done. And just like compared to how much time was spent really delving into what these characters were feeling, what they were going through in the first half of the novel, it felt a little weird to not have that same justice done to the end. But overall, I give it 4 stars. I really recommend this book. It's one of those stories that I continue to think about after I finished it, like these characters have taken a place in my heart. And so I'm definitely really, really excited to see the sequel. I don't know when it's coming out, but it's coming. So this next book I won't talk too much about because I do have a whole video on it, but that's Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare. I thought to include it in this video because that video is entirely spoiler filled, so I figured that if you were curious about my non-spoilery thoughts, I would just talk about them now. Again, I really enjoyed this book. I feel like I'm just repeating myself. I had a pretty good reading time this first half of the year. You can always trust Cassandra Clare to deliver on the drama, the angst, the tragic characters, the emotional love stories. And I was concerned a little bit because the last time that I read a Cassandra Clare book was at least a couple years back. It's been a while. But gosh darn it, she writes addicting books. If you've never read a Cassandra Clare book, I don't think this one is going to be the one that I'm gonna say is like, you have to read this. This does feel very in the same vein of the Infernal Devices, which I do love. So if you want to read those, like I definitely recommend it. But if you have no interest in reading a Cassandra Clare book, then this is not going to change your mind, I don't think. I did think this was a little too long though. Some things happened at the end that I didn't think made the most amount of sense. Like usually I'm down for really dramatic things happening if the author can convince me that this was the only way for it to go down, or that it was a pretty plausible way for it to go down. But some things that happened at the end, I just didn't feel that way. I thought they were very much contrived in order to make me angry. I also feel like I missed out on a lot because I didn't read many of the short stories that came out before this, like specifically in Ghost of the Shadow Market. And to be fair, I don't know if these things are going to be expressed more so in the later books, but especially with the character of Matthew, it constantly felt like I was supposed to know something already, and I didn't. I have to say, I really enjoyed the new content that this book presents, and the idea that these kids, like, because they're the kids of the Infernal Devices crew, that they never had to deal with the extent of trauma and war that their parents went through at their age, which leaves them almost unprepared when they suddenly have to face it now. And I also liked getting to explore the consequences of Tessa and Will's children because of what we learn about Tessa in the Infernal Devices. If you like the Infernal Devices, then you should definitely read this. I think you would definitely like all the cameos that come in, as well as the new compelling cast of characters. And the last book that I'm going to talk about is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. And this is a historical fiction novel set in World War II, and it follows two sisters. Isabel, who is kind of the rebel problem child of her family, lacks a lot of etiquette and really wants to join in the rebel cause. And then you have Vienne, whose husband had to enlist in the war and was taken as a prisoner of war, and also has to quarter a Nazi in her house. And so her main goal is just keeping her and her daughter safe. So the book, I believe, takes place over 5 years, like the entire course of the war from when France was occupied. And it's truly a journey. You see just how much these characters have to go through and how much the war changes people's lives, changes their characters, and forces them in situations that are impossible to think about. I was buddy reading this with my friend, and we were talking about what we were feeling around the halfway point. We were both kind of like this is good, but why is this like such a critically acclaimed novel? Like, what's so special about it? But then I was not prepared for what happened. Similar to the Golem and the Jinni, there's a clear turning point where things just start to go down. And it's not like all that buildup was pointless, it was very purposeful. And when you look back at it after the events later in the book, it's honestly kind of heartbreaking. What was interesting to me is that when I looked at other people's review of this book, a lot of people said that it was very slow and very descriptive. And I would definitely say it's descriptive, but I thought it was pretty fast. And perhaps it was because we were just following a very large timeline, like 5 years, so sometimes we just have time jumps of a few months. But to me, I was like, oh my god, we're already like 6 months later? And yet I still found the story to be so impactful. It was so fascinating and so emotional to see the ways in which the war changed these two people and their relationship as sisters. I don't cry very often in books, but I was flat out sobbing in the last chapter. So if that tells you something about this story. I think if you're normally turned off by historical fiction because of the length or the density, I would give this a try because I think it is one of the more digestible historical fictions that I've read. I never had an issue with it feeling too slow. It always read really quickly. And I gave The Nightingale 5 stars. Low-key just because of how much it made me cry. Like, if something can make me that emotional, then it's gotta be worth reading. So those are all the books that I wanted to talk about. I didn't realize until now how good of a reading year I've had, because I really haven't disliked anything that I read. Hopefully that streak can continue. Please let me know your thoughts on any of these books. I'd love to know. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.